deep in mud, a boy worked alone at the edge of his family's exhausted field, digging hole after uneven hole while the autumn sun pressed down. Soggy dirt streaked up his arms and clung to his cheeks, but he didn't seem to notice. Each little pond lined up beside the last, a messy patchwork on the land. Down the lane, farm trucks slowed almost every hour. Drivers rolled down their windows, some with smirks, others shaking their heads or calling out, "What's the kid making now, a swimming pool for ants?" Laughter echoed from a passing school bus. Snippets of doubt floated over the fence. Old men at the co-op told anyone listening that you can't farm mud and you sure can't water corn with puddles. Still, he kept at it, shovel never pausing, boots squelching with every step. Whatever he was building, nobody could explain. Some thought he was just playing in the dirt. Others muttered that he must know something nobody else did. And as new holes appeared every day, even the skeptics found themselves watching, wondering, and starting to whisper, what if this wild idea actually led somewhere nobody expected? Nestled between wind-battered hills and weathered fence lines, the village had always lived by the calendar and the sky. On the best years, rain came in slow, soaking waves, swelling creeks and brightening pastures until the whole county glowed with promise. But lately, the land seemed to be holding its breath. Dry seasons stacked one after another, leaving fields cracked and gray. The river that once teemed with life was now a thin, silent ribbon, and every well had lost a little of its old generosity. Neighbors gathered at dawn to study the clouds, counting themselves lucky for every brief shower. Here, tradition was more than habit. It was a safeguard. Folks tilled the same rows and coaxed the same crops their grandparents had, hoping that faith and muscle would bring better returns. Risk in a place like this was measured in real losses. The last calf born, the cost of seed, a mortgage payment slipping out of reach. Anything unusual, a new crop, a different tool, or a boy digging where no one else would, pulled whispers and frowns. After all, when so many had already lost so much, every experiment carried the weight of pride, hunger, and a future riding on whether the gamble held or broke beneath the sun. He'd always marched to his own quiet drum, the boy who brought home frog eggs in mason jars and searched the creek for minnows while friends sped by on dirt bikes. His father called him Old Soul Stubborn, the sort who'd spend hours watching clouds crowd the sky or tracing the flight of dragonflies across a stock tank. Money was always tight. After the drought bit hard, the family scrambled. His mother took extra hours at the grocery store, and his father's hands cracked from work that left him too weary for words most nights. Still, at bedtime, the boy would stand by the back porch and listen as his grandfather spun stories of a distant past when ponds dotted the low places and fields never thirsted. The old man's rough hand on his shoulder, steady and sure, anchored him. The land remembers where water once lived, if you listen close. Even when the world seemed set against him, or the teasing grew sharp, the boy clung to those words, believing that what others dismissed as foolish or childish might yet carry the kind of wisdom that could change everything, if only he didn't give up. With every passing week, the laughter grew harsher. At school, two boys planted miniature flags in the muddy holes, dubbing his patch Lake Foolishness. Teachers asked pointedly if he shouldn't be helping more with chores instead of digging in the dirt. Some neighbors' kids started daring each other to jump over his newest ponds, splashing mud everywhere and leaving behind ruined efforts. Even at home, his father's patience ran thin as he eyed the patchwork mess, muttering about wasted shovels and how no real crop could come from so much water and hope. When a rare rainfall finally came, half the ponds filled only to ooze away through cracks, while others grew a stagnant green scum and attracted swarms of mosquitoes. His mother wrung her hands at the front window, whispering worry to his grandfather about what people might say and whether their boy would ever learn not to chase lost causes. Yet each morning, before chores and homework, the boy rose early, patching leaks, scooping scum, moving clay and logs to hold the water. Ridicule sharpened, setbacks multiplied, and doubt nipped at his heels, but stubbornness, mixed with something deeper, kept him digging. If he had a secret, he guarded it close, fueling rumors and feeding the town's growing curiosity. What did he see that nobody else could? One late afternoon, as he sat staring into the largest of his muddy ponds, a faint ripple caught his eye. A tiny tree frog, no bigger than his thumb, clung to a cattail he'd planted weeks before. The frog's eyes sparkled, and just beyond, a strand of dragonfly eggs shimmered in the water's edge. Suddenly he remembered something from his grandfather's stories, how the healthiest land always started with teeming little things, frogs, insects, birds, all feeding and caring for each other in a secret web. Curious, he borrowed an old library book on wetlands and discovered what he'd been missing all along. Small ponds, carefully spaced, could slow down rain, nurture wild plants, and over time recharge the soil. His scattered efforts weren't a failure. They were the beginning of a micro-habitat, one pond connecting to the next like beads on a string. The mistake was thinking each hole stood apart. If he linked them, water and life would move together, changing everything. Heart racing, he drew a new map that night, plotting ways to guide water from one pond to another. The plan growing in his mind as dusk settled. For the first time in months, hope surged, not as a wild dream, but as a pattern waiting to unfold. By dawn, he was back in the field, this time with a purpose that steadied his hands and quickened every step. He measured the distance between each pond, mapping a path for water to flow and overflow, trenching new channels by hand. He learned to line the bottoms with thick clay whenever he found a leak, and hauled wheelbarrow loads of river stones to anchor the banks and slow erosion. Between the ponds, he scattered cattails, duckweed, and creeping clover, hoping their roots would knit the soil and keep water from fleeing too quickly. Sometimes his brother pitched in, lending quiet strength, but most days he worked alone, as wind whipped grit into his eyes and the sun beat down on his back. Tools snapped and were mended. A late frost claimed a few cattails. A dry spell reduced 2 weeks' work to a chain of empty ditches. Yet with every setback he doubled down, borrowing tarps from neighbors, collecting rain from a shed's tin roof, and dragging old boards to shade the tiniest puddles. Nights grew shorter as he lost himself in fixing, connecting, and coaxing every hollow into holding just a little more life. Quiet tension built as a summer thunderstorm brewed, the entire patch suddenly fragile and poised for ruin or renewal. When the first downpour hit, water rushed through his channels, ponds swelling in quick succession, each one feeding the next. He watched, breathless, as the chain held, the 100 tiny ponds shimmering, alive, and no longer just a wild idea, but a true network bursting with possibility. By August, the transformation could no longer be laughed off or ignored. Where dust used to curl off the field, green returned, patches of pasture thickened around the ponds, and stubborn wildflowers rose in velvet bursts along the muddy banks. Dragonflies darted above the water's mirror, weaving patterns with swallows and the flash of a blue heron on silent wings. In one corner, lettuce and beans, which his mother swore would never take, now grew thick and lush, dew lingering long after sunup. Curious foxes began to hunt the edges, and songbirds nested by the pools. The boy's family, drawn by morning walks and evening frog songs, started to linger and watch, trading disbelief for wonder. Neighbors who used to joke began parking their trucks by the fence, staring at the spread of water and life. A few, twice as proud and stoic as any farmer before them, broke the silence to ask what seeds he'd sown and how deep he'd dug the basins. One day, the local paper sent a reporter. By week's end, the school principal brought his science class to sketch the ponds and count the wildlife. Soon enough, the very men who'd called it a waste quietly measured plots for their own marsh gardens. Across dinner tables and at weekend markets, talk turned from laughter to admiration, and the boy who'd once been a punchline became the one others copied, proof that even the smallest acts of vision can turn a whole community's way of thinking upside down. As the season cooled and golden leaves danced across the fields, a new spirit settled in the village. Weekend mornings found neighbors talking along the fence rows, swapping tips on pond depth and plantings, the old resistance replaced by gentle camaraderie. Parents brought children to wade barefoot in mirror-bright pools while elders exchanged stories about how landscapes and people could change. His family, once fretful, now showed him off at church as the boy with 100 ponds. He stood taller, learning how to explain what he'd done, and even teaching classmates eager to copy his network of puddles and streams. The ponds weren't just his secret anymore. They became meeting places for people and for wildlife, pockets of green in a world grown too dry and cautious. The local school added a pond project to its curriculum, and gardens all along Main Street blossomed with native flowers fed by rain barrels and runoff. What began as a solitary struggle for understanding grew into a source of pride, unity, and joy for neighbors and kin alike. The lesson was simple, but lasting. It isn't always the loudest or strongest who change the land. It's the one willing to begin. In every rural town, there's a story of someone who dug where no one else would, a reminder that the greatest harvests often start with a single muddy idea no one else understands. The boy's 100 ponds prove what every innovator knows deep down. Real change rarely looks like a miracle at first glance. It looks like stubbornness or wasted effort or one more failed experiment until, all at once, it blooms into something that feeds both land and spirit. Across the village, fields that had once been dry and silent now shimmer with new possibility, and families gather at their own little marshes, sharing laughter, lessons, and pride. What started as foolishness became wisdom passed from hand to hand, pond to pond, echoing in the green hush of revived soil and the chorus of evening frogs. As folks around here say, water finds a way, and so does hope. Have you ever tried something everyone thought was impossible, only to prove them wrong? Have your quiet innovations made waves that surprised even you? Drop your story in the comments and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Subscribe to join this circle of believers, because sometimes it only takes one dreamer to change the lay of the land for all.